So I just finished the book Free to Choose by Milton and Rose Friedman. It was written in 1980. Many on the right, many conservatives consider him the godfather of modern day capitalistic thought. He's definitely opposed to Keynesian economics. He's definitely opposed to communism and socialism. Many in the Tea Party, many of them believe in more of his laissez-faire type of economics, being careful of debt, being careful of government policies, government intervention. They do want to lax on regulation, and most of the time they don't want really any regulation. He definitely speaks out about the FDA, the EPA, and how economics and capitalists actually do better compared to most governmental programs. So there's many things that he does say that I do agree with, and then there's some things that I just can't agree with. For instance, he does believe that a voucher program for schools and the educational system, kind of based on merit, would do better than just the government having full-blown control of the education system, which most of the time I probably would agree with. Those who actually go to public school might not do as well as those who go to a private school. And I feel like many of the problems with the education system is actually linked to the property tax. Many who have bigger houses, they have more cars, they have more vehicles, maybe they have more possessions that can be taxed by the county. Most that live in that district, most of that money goes to that school of that district, and the funds are not appropriately placed throughout the school district. So when you allow the government to dictate education, you start to have problems. Versus if you kind of base it on a voucher program, schools would be more rewarded with money due to the fact that they're competing. So something like that I do agree with. I do believe that public school system had its place in educating many of Americans, but at the same time, there's many flaws in the education system today. He definitely talks about deregulating a lot of things. He's definitely that of an anti-unionist. He does make some interesting points. I don't know quite how I feel about it. I've heard some of the benefits of unionization, but then he also says that because unions dictate the price, it actually might work well for the union supporters or those of that union, but it hinders those in the same field because now they can't necessarily compete with those prices, or businesses might not be willing to pay those prices. So that, I don't know kind of how I feel about that just yet. I definitely want to dive more into that. He does have a problem like the EPA. I have read many of the benefits of the EPA, protecting different carcinogens in the air, different fumes, different carcinogens in our foods, and even like something like lead paint. Them building certain highways too close to homes, people getting sick, pollutants in the water. If you look at a facility here in North Carolina, Duke Energy definitely polluted many of the waterways. If you look at West Virginia and the coal mines, many of those, when it rains, or many of the chemicals and the deadly toxins that are coming from the coal mine end up in the water system, is actually killing many in the Appalachians, causing cancer and stuff like that. But he does make valid point about the Federal Reserve, and how them increasing the money supply, decreasing the money supply, them being privatized. He does definitely talk about money in politics, many things that we would all agree with. And then he also talks about the need for us to globalize And in part, I see where he's coming from, but in the same time, we see many of the downfalls that we have today when you have countries like China making many of our products. So when we had COVID, there's a whole supply chain problem. Of course, by producing things here in America will probably increase the cost of things, but at a certain point in time, making sure that America is taken care of, that seems a little bit more important than maybe necessarily lining the pockets of the select few corporations. Now, he does come more from a capitalist thought. When you do look at what's kind of going on in America now, we're definitely living in an oligarchy where the billionaires and the ultra elite and these big corporations, they're getting all the benefits of the politicians that they lobby to in Washington D.C. They're getting the tax breaks. They're able to commit crimes domestically and overseas and get away with it. There's just a lot of different things, and I do see where he comes from, but at the same time, you do have to have some kind of regulations, like Nestle, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me, but if I remember correctly, the Supreme Court allowed and said that child labor in Africa to support their company is great, and we see that there's child labor to be able to support many of these iPhones and these new TVs and a lot of these electronics, including your car, your electric car, and many of the different components that we use, which I don't necessarily see as being fair. So I do think that regulation does need to be there, because you can't necessarily just trust corporations to always do the right thing, especially when they pay and they buy politicians to overlook and excuse these immoral practices. You look at prison labor. America has the highest prison population in the entire world, and many of the cheap labor actually comes from prison, or it comes from imprisoning those, which is literally fueled by Congress making laws that have nothing to do with the sanctity of our individuality. You might not agree with somebody smoking meth or doing heroin, but if you sit here and say that the government doesn't have a right to put untested vaccine in us, then who are we to sit here and say what the government can and cannot do with somebody in their addiction? And we have seen consistently over time and time again, whether you look at the opioid crisis or you look at the crack epidemic, the government did not solve these problems by using the war on drugs, by outlawing everything. So now the government is forced to make more laws to incarcerate us. Now it's getting to the point where the poor are just being incarcerated for no reason. So I do believe that there has to be some kind of, governmental regulations. There has to be some kind of a moral compass that, dictates the laws that are created. And we also see that many of these corporations, we see that many of these politicians, we see, in many cases, these bureaucracies will not even uphold the Constitution, which was written by our founding fathers to protect us from government, tyranny. So we do have to be very careful, but he does make valid points. So in the sense of capitalist thought, if I make a product and you make a product, and you're starting to get bad reviews and customers are starting to disapprove of your product, so they might be willing to come to my product. So hopefully with that fight amongst the two capitalists, the two, me and you may see the flaws in your product in comparison to the benefits of my product. Or, you might charge ridiculously high for your product or your service, and I might be willing to undercut you. And so, there allows for that competition. So I do see that, and I do see the benefits of that, because, capitalists, they're the backbone to majority of the small businesses, which provide many of the jobs that many of us have. But at the same time, we do see, Amazon, getting humongous government subsidies. we see that Walmart employees are actually being subsidized in many cases by by welfare programs. So, there definitely has to be some kind of regulation, some kind of oversight, some kind of encouragement to protect Americans. He does make the argument that, with each developing skill set, employers should pay more, which is something that I do agree with. I listen to a lot of Patrick Bet-David. Shout out to him and his podcast, him and all of his business related materials. Great, check it out. But listening to him over the years, it seems like he definitely does pay and reward his good employees with pay increases and different benefits. But when you look on the contrast of many other businesses, many of them are not willing to pay what it takes. We have seen since 1980 nearly approximately $50 trillion has been siphoned from the middle and lower class to allow products and services, whether you're looking at housing, food, gas, whatever, has outpaced our paychecks. So every year, more and more people are feeling like they're losing more and more money. You make $100,000 in 2023, 2022, it feels like you barely made it. We're looking at 70% of, people living paycheck to paycheck. And yes, in many cases, it is because of people and their bad spending habits. I'm a victim of my own spending habits. Many times I could be saving more. I could be making better decisions with my money. But at the same time, I've also have the ability to make more money, and every time I go out the door, gas is going up, food is going up, the cost of everything is going up, rent is going through the roof, mortgages are going through the roof, and the cost of housing, all of these different factors. So when you have businesses who are not actually looking out for the best interest of America, or not looking out for the best interest of American workers, then now we have a problem, especially when they're willing to go send our jobs to China for a cheaper product. And then, half these things don't even last 5-10 years. Most of the things that you buy, break down within a year or a couple of years. And then you look at some of the products that were made in the 50s and 60s, like my grandparents, many of them had the same appliances that they had when my mom was a kid. So, things aren't really made with quality anymore. So in those instances, I have to disagree with his thought. I do believe that the Federal Reserve is the worst thing for America. It was the worst non-governmental bank. Many of the founding fathers spoke against a central bank, but here we are, over 100 years later, 110 years later, and we've literally allowed the Federal Reserve to literally buy the world, buy many of, and actually socialize our tax dollars, and pretty much buy corporations or stocks in corporations secretly. So we're not necessarily nationalizing things like how Fidel Castro did when he became in power. Like, okay, this company, these lands, these farmers, these houses belong to the government. In that sense, no, what we do is, we have these boom and bust cycles. And so when things bust and the prices of everything falls and all these corporations need bailouts, well, it's secretly written that the Federal Reserve will buy these debts or buy these shares of these stocks at a lower price. So that in itself is nationalization. That in itself is socialism for the rich. So I do agree with a lot of what Milton Friedman talks about, but at the same time, we can't be just naive, and we can't just say that everything sounds good underneath the sun, because it doesn't. We can't just sit here and say just because Ronald Reagan was of the thought of Milton Friedman that, the whole Republican Party should be dictated by solely his thoughts or all of his thoughts. We can accept a large majority and not just throw out the baby with the bathwater. So like, share, subscribe. I'm going to continually read more books, give y'all more knowledge, keep up with current events and politics. Just hopefully be able to keep y'all entertained, give me critical things, critiques that I could do better on, and better ways to, you know, add value to this channel. Well, thank you.